Prioritizing compliance when launching or growing a marketplace can be a powerful mechanism for growth. In this segment, George Trantas, Senior Director, Global Marketplaces at Avalara, will explore the importance of marketplace tax compliance for startups and established brands alike.
I've been 3.5 years at Avalara. I've been 20 plus years in e-commerce, and so I am by no means a tax person. So I'm gonna ask a quick question. Are there any finance people in the room? That's a resounding no, so perfect. We got one finance person. So the way I sort of think of tax and compliance in the e-commerce space is, if you're an e-commerce focused person, a VP of e-commerce or something like that, you tend to think of tax as the last thing that you want to talk about. So what I want to talk about is the state of e-commerce, where marketplaces are going, and then how do you maximize growth in this channel without having a lot of delays in the launch of programs. And so, some interesting facts about, you guys probably have seen these, but about $4.8 trillion happens in e-commerce total, or in retail sales. 3.25 happens on marketplaces of that trillion. So obviously you got some big ones, Amazon, eBay, and the US, Alibaba, and Tmall in Asia. But as we look at this, a lot of the growth is coming from marketplaces. And we're seeing this with large retailers, Macy's, added a marketplace with Miracle. We're seeing this with other big brands. And so how do we understand, how do we take part in that? So I put a little stat up here. The 96 million, 97 million is happening on social commerce. So this is sort of the new trend. We're seeing this with TikTok and Instagram. And so that's just a really small number that we think we're going to see some significant growth with. I like to look at these last two percentages on the right side here as we sort of look at the business. 53% of adults started to search on Amazon. If you think about that, where do you put your brand? How do you get your items out there to be found? That's always a struggle in e-commerce. And so, that's where, when we think about marketplaces and how you can help your brand, if you've got traffic to your site and you're not converting on those items because the search is not, finding any item specifics, marketplace is a perfect spot, to bring that in. And how do you not have a lot of costs? But that last one, 44% of consumers discovered a brand on a marketplace and made a purchase from the website. So that's really interesting. When I started at eBay in 2012, there was this huge hate of eBay. There was a dumping ground of product. People thought it was a bad place to be. But eBay, Amazon, Poshmark, things like that have really evolved and to become the norm. And then if you look at the potential of worldwide sales on both B2B and B2C, there's such great opportunity out there. And so we want to really focus on how do we make sure we're being successful in that launch of a marketplace. So if you're an e-commerce website, you've been doing business, established, you probably have a tax team, accounting department, and finance team. Those guys understand your business. There's buyers buying goods, they register that inventory into their site, and they have some sort of tax code associated with that. When you have a marketplace, you may be bringing on thousands of new items a day that don't actually exist on your site. So those are things to think about as we get on this. And so when you're making this sort of transition from an e-commerce store to an online marketplace, you're bringing in a lot of different potential products, thought process. How do we source inventory? How do we source merchants? What's the goal of the business, first of all? So is it to create an endless aisle? Is it to create ancillary items? We met with a large retailer yesterday that uses Avalara, and they're going to actually launch some local stuff around their business. So that's really interesting. So instead of being a national marketplace, they're going to have local there. So, and when you think online marketplace versus e-commerce store, sometimes there is no difference. You want to make that seamless experience for the customer. So if it's a marketplace item or your item, you want to make sure you have the same service execution and things like that. So if you're collecting payment and processing goods, checkout, all those things have to look like your business. So that's really important. So you got to find a provider. There's a lot of them out there, Miracle, Marketplacer, Striker. There's 3 or 4 I just mentioned that were sort of leading the area, but there's a bunch of other ones that are actually coming in the space. So make sure you figure out which ones you want to do, how you want to do it, and then how do you execute upon it. And so one of the things we talk about at Avalara a lot is, on the marketplace side, is how do we maximize the growth? And so it's probably odd to hear a tax provider talking about maximizing growth, but if we're going to bring a customer into our ecosystem and walk them through this, I want to make sure they're understanding the full scope and breadth. So, probably if you're thinking about launching a marketplace on an e-commerce site, you started this process 18 months before coming to the tax side of the business. And so that's one of the things that we tend to see as a struggle, is you come late to this sort of tax. And so growth and compliance really go hand in hand in our opinion. And so where are you bringing that, that finance team into the business? What's the first question they're going to ask you? So I always tell my team, know all the questions before you go into the room. So if you're bringing in these new items, thousands of items, millions of items, whatever your goal is, how are you going to collect the taxes? How are you going to remit them? Are you responsible for that? And that's where my team can come in and help answer some of those questions. If you're working with an accounting firm, obviously, the Big Four will help you with that. But what's the process? And so the tactics and logistics we tend to see is you spend all this time working with the e-com team, the development team, building the site, building the functionality, make sure it all works. And then 3 months before launch, you go, we need to figure out tax. And you go, how fast can we integrate tax into that? There's a couple components of that make it really tough. What are you selling? That's the first thing about tax that you really want to think about is, these are just a couple of random examples that we always have like a wacky Wednesday tax day at Avalara. But if you're selling clothing and shoes and you're going to bring in electronics, there's a whole bunch of other things to consider. If you've never sold food, these are just some food items here, but like bottled water may be taxable in a convenience store, but not a grocery store. Toothbrushes and dental floss are taxed, differently in states. Ice cream by volume. If you're a sports marketplace and you're going to add tickets, venue size is something that we have to think about. This is just endless opportunity for mistakes. And mistakes in tax cost money and they cost time. And then what happens is your finance team will tend to shut this program down and extend the sales cycle or the life cycle of that. So we had a couple examples where the marketplace was ready to go in that 30 to 90 day window, and tax team said, let's stop this. And this happens across small and large businesses. And so when the tax team gets involved, typically the CFO gets involved, the finance team, they go, let's delay this project. And it could be a year depending on how confident you are in your business. So 2 things to think about is how are you going to actually determine what these items are when they come in at scale? So tax codes are what sort of drive the foundation of tax in most systems. And so how are you going to tax those? How are you going to create that system? And how are you going to build that? At Avalara, we have multiple teams that actually can do this. But if you're going to bring in 1 million items in a day and not have a plan, that's really where the foundation comes in of making sure you're safe and protected. The other challenges that come with, anytime you're launching a new business inside your core business is what's different about that? Are you need new reporting? So your reporting was for your internal business. You're now creating reporting for external customers that are vendors. So what does that look like? How does it work? And so, you obviously probably pass W-9s to contractors and send out 1099s. But in the marketplace world, at $600, you're going to have to collect and file a 1099. It was $20,000. It's moving to $600. So that's a law change. The Informed Consumer Act. Are you selling high value items? Those are things that are going to require you to know more about your merchant. So what data are you collecting on that merchant? How are you storing it? Where are you storing it? How are you going to pass that back to the government? These are all things to think about. As we go through the sort of the process with a customer that's launching a marketplace, I always think about the basics. All right, what's the platform you're running on? What's the tools you have? And then how are you going to get this data back to you? And so if you're going to use a pre-built connector, sometimes the data doesn't flow as cleanly as we'd like. So at Avalara, we've got a whole series of APIs built for marketplaces that pass this data back. Massachusetts is a state that requires a form to be filed, I think it's ST16, that says at the end of the day, you've actually collected the tax. And so those are just things that I think about. And so if we can get early in the cycle of building that marketplace, it's really crucial for the success of that program and launching it fast. So we've probably all seen this napkin before, Jeff Bezos' napkin. It's, it's our job every day to make an important aspect of the customer experience a little bit better. And so the goal of a marketplace should be, inside of your e-commerce site, should be to improve the experience. How do you improve the experience by adding more items is probably the challenge that you're going to have is quality of data. So creating a structured data system is really crucial. So if you have free-form data, we've all probably shopped on eBay versus shopping on Amazon. Amazon's clean, structured data. But you can tell a marketplace item sometimes because the data has got misspellings, it's got odd characters. So scrubbing that data when it comes into your system is also important. And then also, what are the goals of that sale. So after it sells, it's going to be delivered in a timely fashion, making sure you have all these metrics and tracking handled. I think let's see here. Oops, sorry. I'm going to go back 2 slides here. So the first thing we always think about or the second thing we think about is nexus. Are you collecting tax in every state? If you are, fantastic, you're going to keep doing that. If you're not, when you launch a seller in that state, he has his own nexus. And that's something to think about. So typically with marketplaces, we think about how do we make sure we are registered in every state. So if you're a newer business, you may only register in 5 or 6 states. When you create this marketplace, you want to create as less friction you can for the buyer and the seller. And so the sellers in that sort of that sales cycle, how do you launch them? Well, first of all, you got to make sure you're collecting tax on their behalf. There are some, you might not be legally obligated, but if you're not, you're going to collect money from the state and then pass it through to them, and then they have to file it. That's going to be a friction point in that sales cycle. So I don't really think about how do we create a great transaction for the buyer without creating a great transaction for the seller. And so you just want to make sure you have that. Establishing how you're going to pay them. That's really important. Like, what's the process? It's going to be daily, weekly, monthly. Is it going to be after delivery? It's going to be make sure there's no defects. And then customer service. How are you going to handle the customer service aspect of a marketplace? And that's really something that's very different. Your customer service team knows the items they sell currently. How are you going to make sure they understand the items you don't have, that they've never touched? What does that look like? And then one thing that I always think about is if you're in the world of non-electronic goods, and then you start selling electronics, are you aware of all the fees and exposure you may have in California and other states as they add that? So California passed some laws last year that required e-waste fees and other fees for disposal of items. So just think about those. Our team can help you. A lot of tax content people out there, the Big Four will walk you through this. But how do you implement that into your site? Do you need a special line for tax? Can it be blended into the tax? Colorado had that retail delivery fee, which, has everyone aware of that Colorado retail fee? It's 29 cents for every item you get shipped into Colorado. It was a real pain that first sort of month when it launched. How do you display it? What's the requirements? How do you actually charge it? And so what we're seeing now is as we get those fees passed, adopted, other states start following suit. So I think it's Minnesota and New York will start adding that fee in 2024. And that's the one thing that we harp onto the accounting teams at these retailers that are launching a marketplace. Our software, and we use a third-party provider like us, it enables you to set it and forget it, the old George Foreman sort of comment. You don't have to worry about the actual business of being compliant when there's a software for you. So our job at Avalara is to make sure that you don't have any issues in that. And so we always go through, how do we set this up? So the first thing you want to do is get your tax code mappings assigned to your category structure. So in that marketplace, if you're going to launch ancillary categories you didn't have before, build a good category structure that has good content and good descriptions, and then pre-fill those into your tools that you're going to use. So if you're using a Miracle or Marketplace, make sure those categories fit in there and they're well aligned. We have a team that will actually do the tax code mapping for you, so if that's a worry, you can outsource it. But when you get those items come in, you'll have a clean set of tax lines, you'll have a whole reporting side, and then all that tax filing and jurisdictional filing will be handled for you. There will be some returns that your tax team, if they're doing their own, have never seen before. And so it's just something to be sure they're aware of. So Missouri has a very unique filing for Marketplace, and so does Washington State. And so the goal at the end of the day is to make the business successful. And how do you drive that? So in an endless aisle situation, you should be looking at the past data of what people are looking for in your site and adding that to the cart or adding that to the site. Don't think about just adding random products to the site because it's not going to actually drive value or what your intent is. And then make sure they're items that are meet your policies or create new policies. So if you're not selling mattresses, I love this one. We had a seller that was selling, was a clothing seller that had some home goods, and they decided to add mattresses. It was a natural fit, but they didn't think about the shipping, they didn't think about the returns, and so it created a sort of what I call a nightmare in their customer service team. So they sort of turned that off for a minute, and they went to a bunch of experts and said, what do you recommend? When you're adding a large retailer that is going to be going into your marketplace, follow what they're already doing. Get their information. So go to that retailer and say, how do you do this today, and how should I implement the policy correctly? And so on that page, you might actually see some things that are very specific to that product, and that's important. So don't think about just this overall, I'm going to add items. Make sure you're conscious of what those items are and how they work in your business. And so, as we get into Informed Act, W-9s, if you're going to ship internationally, that's another product that, if you're, well, let me rephrase it. If you're currently shipping internationally, how are you going to support international shipping on the marketplace? Or are you? There are a lot of things to consider. One, your rates for shipping may not match their rates. Two, are you going to provide the label for them? And so that's something that's really interesting we see is the best marketplaces provide the best customer experience for their sellers and their buyers. So the label you're using now probably should fit into the label scheme that you have. And so in the shipping world, when it comes from one facility, you're probably getting a discount. So consolidation, maybe look at that. But as long as you're providing that same experience, customers will tend to come back and drive this growth cycle. I always think about what's the end goal and how do I solve it? And then you back into those steps. And I really want to stress that the easiest part of the marketplace is probably the e-commerce side. It's that back-end logistics of all these reporting and making sure all the customers and buyers have the same experience. So I wanted to just pause for a second. I know we've got a couple people here that may have launched or are thinking about launching a marketplace. Are there any questions real quick that I could answer on that side? All right, great crowd participation here. It's late in the day. So let's finish this up with a couple real world stories of things that have worked and not worked. So if you go on any marketplace, you'll see Poshmark is launching large sellers. It's typically a small seller business. And so there's some positive and negatives. eBay has done this through the years. They've launched really large sellers into their marketplace. Remember, the larger the seller, the more inventory they're going to bring, but also the more of their own rules they want to establish. So it's sort of a push-pull when you're talking about where you're bringing those sellers in from and what they're bringing. Establish real fine guidelines on what you want in that early stages of your setup of your marketplace, and then carry that forward into execution. So if you're looking to add, like I said, not endless aisle, but very specific aisles, make sure you keep that established framework. And so that helps with tax, helps with reporting, and it also helps with that customer experience. And at the end of the day, you'll have a much better outcome from the business. Okay. Yep. So the question is, how do you? Yeah. So how do you handle tax outside the U.S.? So international. So VAT. So in a marketplace scenario, deemed supplier is what Europe is calling their marketplace facilitator laws. So it's happened in the UK and the EU. Those went in July 1st, 2022, and January 1st, 2022 in the UK. I might be having backward, but they're there. They are refining those rules every 6 months. And so what we know in the UK and EU, we're going to start seeing a lot more actually reporting requirements. So live reporting, e-invoicing is coming into effect across Europe by 2025. We've seen it in Spain, Poland, and some of the other smaller countries. And it just requires another burden on the retailer. Right now, it's sort of a hot mess, I would like to describe this as, of each country's got their own rule set on top of the EU's rule set. And so if you just choose your own countries, if you say, I'm gonna go to the UK, France, and Germany, it's really easy. The hard part of that is, are you gonna go US outbound only, or are you gonna start finding sellers in those markets? Because that creates its own sort of set of rules and boundaries on how you create tax. So what I recommend is phase one, if you're a US seller, start with US outbound into those countries because you can control what your environment is. And then phase 2 and 3, if you find you've got success in those markets and you want to source local items, that's when you've got to talk to your tax provider, your big four, whoever the person is. And if you don't have one, we can recommend a few. But making sure you understand what it is to have to do inter-country versus into the EU, and then what are the reporting requirements going to be. We know they will change. That is the nature of government. They're going to add more regulation. And then what are the requirements to file? So in live reporting, you may be paying taxes every 4 days. So when the transaction happens on Monday, you're paying the tax by Friday. So how are you funding that, and what does that look like? Obviously, you're going to need a digital service for that. It's not a manual process. And then back to the old days of cross-border is like, how do you display that item? Are you going to have duty-inclusive pricing? Are you going to show with VAT? Because you can do all those, or you can just do a different model where you show the price, and then at checkout you say, here's your duty, here's your VAT. And it's not a clean experience when you do it that way. So a lot of options in cross-border. I typically tell people, if you're launching the marketplace, maybe exclude those day one, and then you start bringing it in slowly, because you're adding complexity to the business, and then on top of complexity, you're adding international. And so you're adding not just one level of complexity more, you're adding 10 levels of complexity more. And then what are the requirements? Can you ship the item? So that's the other thing. So at Avalara, inside of our Avatax API, we actually have a cross-border engine that will help determine restrictions and also provide the duties and taxes. So it is one API call, but it does require some knowledge on that side. If you have a logistics team, that would be the time to involve those guys, because they'll know some of these answers as well. Great question. My time is up here, so I want to sort of be conscious of that, and don't hold everybody from the awards and the happy hour. So I want to thank CommerceNext, and turn my time back to Ilan.